Hello, and welcome to another thought-provoking episode of Front Porch Radio. I'm your host, Julie Wilder, and in this episode, we're diving deep into some of the most complex and, quite frankly, unnerving currents shaping our world today. Since the pandemic, I've been grappling with a sense of unease, especially when it comes to the way spiritual and political worlds have collided. On one hand, the conservative right has been increasingly framing their support for Donald Trump as being divinely inspired, while on the other, I've observed factions of the liberal-leaning spiritual communities drifting into MAGA territory, going so far as to describe Trump as a light worker. In all honesty, I had been staring at Gary Lachman's book, Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump, on my bookshelf for months, and finally worked up the courage to start reading it. His insights have been invaluable in understanding the connections between the occult and the political movements we're witnessing today. Gary's ability to tie together these players in these strange, shadowy narratives is remarkable. His analysis is both scholarly and deeply necessary. In fact, Dark Star Rising is, to me, one of the most important works for making sense of the chaos around us, precisely because it illuminates a very real influence that no one in mainstream media has on their radar. This investigation into the unseen explains hidden influences and the seeming unreality that has taken on a life of its own. The book even connects these esoteric concepts to the role of memes in media, where figures like Trump are portrayed as symbols that influence reality itself, blending the lines between fantasy and fact. As someone who has watched my own imaginative visions become reality, but has also been critical of movements like The Secret or the power of positive thinking, I can honestly say reading this book has blown my mind, made sense of the nonsensical, and has been a missing piece to the puzzle for me. We find ourselves in the inaugural days of a second Trump term. A quick review: Elon Musk made an unmistakable Nazi salute twice during a speech, and Trump clearly said that he is the president because the election was rigged in his favor. After reading Dark Star Rising, I feel author Gary Lachman is the perfect person to help us make sense of it all. He's the author of several influential books on the intersections of mysticism, politics, and history. A man who has spent decades exploring the relationship between the occult and the modern world, teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies and appearing in several documentaries. He's also an inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a founding member of the pop group Blondie. Born in New Jersey, Mr. Lachman joins us today from his home in London. Welcome to Front Porch Radio.
Thank you very much, Julie, for inviting me to be on your show.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been really earth-tilting for me going through your book, and I feel like I can see what I couldn't see before, and I can't unsee it. So now I'm looking at everything through this lens that you have given me. This is a really powerful and uncommon lens that really makes sense of the bewildering things. When did you know that you had to write about the rise of Trump? And I know you're across the sea, but how are you now that he's gained office a second time?
Well, this answer to the second question is easier. Not very well about it. I find it quite upsetting, like many other people do as well. But to answer the first question, I was asked to write the book, and strangely enough, the reason I was asked, Richard Spencer, who was the leader of the once fashionable but now forgotten alt-right, who were fellow travelers with Trump, and I might get into them later on, but they claim to be responsible for helping him getting into the White House the first time, helping his election. And strangely enough, he came to the attention of the world's media at the time for precisely the same reason that Elon Musk has now. I mean, that people know who Musk was obviously before, but with the gesture he made, because right after the day after the 2016 election, Spencer was the head of also something called the National Policy Institute, which I don't know whether it exists, but it's a very innocuous sounding name for a far-right, ultra-conservative sort of think tank sort of thing. And they were having their annual meeting in the Ronald Reagan building the day after the election. And a couple hundred people there. And he came in and he starts saying, "Hail Trump, hail our leader. We made this happen. We made this dream come true." And then he did the salute thing, which he also later claimed was a Roman salute, as some people are saying now, a Musk. And I just want to say, okay, fine and dandy, but what's so good about that? The Romans aren't particularly good role models. I mean, despotic emperors just doing whatever they want and stuff like that. It's
And
like,
I'm pretty sure like the neo-Nazis are also like celebrating the salute that he did. So it
yeah.
seems like they saw the
So,
same thing that the rest of us might have seen.
sure, sure. Well, yeah. Well, any case, so that came to the attention of the world, news and the CNN and all that sort of thing. But well, someone who does a blog on New Thought pointed out that when Spencer was saying, we made this dream come true, we willed this to happen and things of that sort, it sounded like kind of mental science sort of thing, a New Thought, philosophy. And so my editor at Penguin at the time asked me, so, okay, what do you think about this? Do you think something's there and all that? And so you start looking into it. And then Trump turns out to be a devotee of Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, this very popular book in the 1950s, which is a Christianized version of mental science. And you mentioned Rhoda Byrne and The Secret and things of that sort. It's basically thoughts are things. And if you focus your thoughts on what you want to achieve, your goals and your ends fervently enough and determinately enough and long enough, they'll become real. And so Trump grew up on this stuff. His father was a devotee as well. And when he was young, they used to go to his sermons, Peale's sermons. And I say in the book, and I've said in talks, one can gauge how influenced he was by Peale, or Trump was by Peale, by his quote that after sitting through one of his sermons, he said he could, sit through another one again. And for somebody who has the attention span of a gnat, the fact that he could sit through something like that certainly says that, this meant something to him. So, and then also Steve Bannon, who's still sort of hovering in the background, but was on Trump's bench, in a talk he gave to a group of very conservative churchmen in the Vatican, which was reported on by the New York Times. He mentions the name Julius Evola, and Julius Evola was a 20th century Italian esoteric thinker with very far-right political views, and who tried to ingratiate himself and had some success with both Mussolini and National Socialism. And then he became a kind of eminence grise in the post-war period to neo-fascist sort of groups and so on and so on. And he's sort of as an intellectual, he has an intellectual caliber and all that. So he's not just a raving loony. And so in this talk to the conservative churchman in the Vatican, Bannon name checks him. And then he also name checks him and name checks Evola in the context of talking about Putin. And admiration he has for Putin's support for the traditional roles, much like the traditional roles that Trump is now, making law across the land, so traditional gender roles and family roles and things of that sort. And Evola is part of a esoteric school called the Traditionalists, which you can sort of see as far-right esoteric thinkers, or a fundamentalist esoteric rather than far-right. So, although some of them certainly were, but sort of like fundamentalist esotericists. And so suddenly all this kind of stuff that was like fringe. I mean, I've been interested in this sort of stuff for a long time, but it's precisely because, it's weird, it's on the fringe and that kind of thing. Suddenly it was becoming center stage. And it seemed like with Trump's election, everything was possible. And that was the kind of motto, or, their war cry then. I think it was Melania or maybe his daughter at the Republican convention back then saying, now everything is possible. And whenever we think everything is possible, that sounds, wow, that's great. But actually, well, think about it. Everything's possible. So it's not necessarily just all the nice things are possible. So I was asked to start looking into this. And I started to see one thing after the other. And I mentioned Putin, and Putin has a fellow around him, and he's still around today. He's still a player today, this fellow named Alexander Dugin, who is a contemporary adherent of this sort of traditionalist school, but in a post everything kind of way. He's someone who's had a very, very strange, bizarre trajectory. He started out in the 1980s as a kind of anti-Soviet punk, and he was arrested for singing anti-Soviet songs and was thrown to Lubyanka, which is his famous prison. But then with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, he suddenly became a Soviet man, and he's just been incarnated in various different kind of mashups of different totalitarian kind of politics. National Socialism and all the good stuff, all the good stuff from all the totalitarian, he cherry picks, and the only untouchable political system would be liberal democracy, which he just sees is the bane of all evil on the planet. And if you spend time on these days, or it's a cesspool of all this kind of stuff. It's just flooded with that. But he posts stuff, or some account saying it's him posts stuff, and he's very, very happy at what's happening. And now, the new world is coming in, and he has this vision. And Putin's talked about this. He has Putin's ear, a bit, at different times and all that. But this whole idea of Eurasia, as Russia, it's not a new, well, it's not just a country, it's a whole new civilization that's rising up. And it stretches from Vladivostok to Dublin. And, so it's that, and it's the largest landmass on the planet. And so one of the things that I talk about in that book, and it's still going on now, because Dugin is still around, is this, he has this fundamental kind of metaphysical belief that there's this one war going on throughout all history. And it's between what he calls the mercantile maritime nations, the Atlanticists, and then there's the mother of all land masses, Eurasia. This is the largest landmass. So it's like solid and fluid and becoming, so being and becoming in this continual kind of battle. And he has envisioned some kind of knockdown, slam dunk kind of, final, conflict between Eurasia and all the globalists and all that kind of thing. So for Trump coming in and becoming, America first and all that is good news, because the globalists are going to be losing, a lot of, their backing and all that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I mean, it's going to be, it's kind of felt like the wild, wild west, and it feels like it's going to be a little bit more of that. Now, I know that in the book, you really talk about like Trump being a chaos magician and like the way that he's playing with reality. And I know that this kind of started for you with, kind of investigating the occultist belief systems of the actual players that are at play right now. But then you kind of get into Trump himself as this kind of this character who's literally like, people are always like trying to manifest reality. And usually it's, in the direction of something good. And I'm like, oh, he's really trying to manifest reality in a not so pleasant way. When he's saying things, you're like, what?
Well, I mean, that's it. Like, that's one thing is just don't deviate. You never deviate from the script, and it's always positive, and it's always yes, and it's always this, and it's the biggest, and it's like other totalitarian type figures or big leader figures like Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin. He's a fan of gigantism. He likes things to be really, really big and things of that sort, Trump Towers and so on and so on. But I mean, the thing with Trump and the positive thinking. So the basic idea that reality is malleable, okay? And power positive thinking, the quote actually comes from psychiatrist Menninger, but Peale uses it. And actually it goes back to Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher. It says, basically, facts don't matter. It's what you think about the facts that matter, right? So what you think about things is what's really important, not the things themselves. Things themselves are malleable. So Epictetus, he's not trying to change the world, but that's a Stoic way to endure the world. It's like, well, yes, there's horrible things happening to you and you can't do anything about it, but you can at least decide on how you're going to react to it. Right. How are you going to deal with it? So it's that's, and funnily enough, and Stoicism is very, very hot seller these days on Amazon and things like that, and it's a philosophy of how to deal with difficult times. So I'm not surprised at all that that's the case. The other thing with Trump is that he was brought up on that, and then he had this whole television program, The Apprentice, all that kind of thing, and then he was involved in wrestling, and then beauty contests, and so. This whole kind of, the wrestling, the beauty contest, that's all glamour. It's all, putting on a show. Yeah. It's putting on a show, it's putting on something. It's people are dazzled, by what you're doing. So that's something that he really developed how to do. That's a way of manipulating reality. And then The Apprentice was a dry run for what he's doing now. He wore the suit, had the tie, he hired, he fired, he was generous, magnanimous, he was stern, and unrepentant, and and one thing that made me think of, there's a book written in the 40s by a fellow named Siegfried Krakauer, who was part of a school called the Frankfurt School in Germany, and then later in New York at the New School in New York, Manhattan. But he wrote a book called From Caligari to Hitler. And his idea was that all of these films in, say, the 1910s, 1920s, leading up to the rise of National Socialism, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if you know this film, or M, with Peter Lorre, and these other German ones called about Dr. Mabuse, who's this kind of mastermind criminal who controls everything. So the whole idea is that these kind of strange mastermind figures, controlling things. And this Krakauer's thesis was that this primed the German people for the Führer, the leader, someone to step in and all that. And then in the academic world for the last, let's say, starting up probably 1960s, the whole idea of there being any kind of objective, stable reality with the big, with the capital R, and a truth with a capital T that was available to us, got very shaky. It had always been in different contexts, but it became kind of de rigueur. It became like, that we finally, various different reasons for that. But postmodernism and deconstructionism, which were, I don't know what it is these days, but they were building up then. And when I was back in university in the 80s, they were like the hot thing. And the whole idea was that, there's no stable reality. It's all a social construct. But, social influences affect epistemology and how we know things and how we understand things and what we believe to be true and all that kind of thing. One of the first things Trump did now was, rescind all of the gender,
Right.
things. So it's a bang.
So, he's like, there's no race.
Well, I'm saying, but that would be one real expression of like this kind of, I would say that would also be an expression of, reality being malleable. I identify as X, and so I am X. And you have to also identify me as X, or I'll, whatever, something will happen. So that became a kind of extreme, expression of that in the kind of, what do you want to call it? The progressive world.
Right.
And which emerged culturally, socially out of this academic climate in which it was like, yes, everything is social construct. There's no such thing as objective truth, and blah, 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 and that kind of thing. So from different perspectives, from different avenues, the notion of a reality that was malleable, that you could change. And I think Trump probably, I'm sure he might have heard of postmodern just in terms of an architecture. Yeah, give me something postmodern, down in Atlantic City or whatever. But suddenly the idea that reality is up for grabs, I'll go with that. And anything is possible. So all of those things kind of came together. At least this is what I said in the book. It struck me that this all seemed to be happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And then there were more specific kind of claims made by Richard Spencer and other people in the alt-right that they had used the internet, which itself is a simulacra of reality. And so, we all take it for granted now that, oh, gee, reality, there was a time when it was all like, what's going on here? It was scary. Now it's like, oh yeah, we just kind of accept it now,
Yeah. So, I mean, the social media really came, it's been coming, alive. If we can talk about reality here, it was becoming alive also throughout this thread. We went more from like one story, right, that authority or whatever was telling us was reality, to this multiple story where you have all kinds of people saying, no, actually, indigenous people have known that there was multiple genders since the beginning of time, So we have all of these converging stories going on, but then we have like this social media where ideas can spread rapidly. And you really, one of the things that really fascinated me, you talked a lot about Pepe the Frog, which I want you to explain what that was. I didn't know about Pepe, but it made me think of the Simpsons episodes where it's like, oh my God, was he predicting the future? Like, all of these
Well, we can go down that rabbit hole. I've written about that as well, because I've written a book about precognitive dreams, and I've been having them for 40 plus years. But this, yeah, there was the whole thing with, the Simpsons episode, Trump and all that. But with Pepe the Frog, I don't know if Pepe the Frog is a cartoon character, and that became sort of co-opted by the alt-right I mentioned earlier. And he's a slacker amphibian. The cartoonist's name is Matt Fury. And I always joke that he later became Matt Furious, because his creation became a kind of, hate speech, symbol or sigil or magical sigil. Because first off, people, pop stars, Nicki Minaj and Katy Perry and people like that were, posting memes with Pepe.
Mhm.
And then, okay, we have to get into this. There's this whole generation of these disaffected teenagers who got into posting all this stuff online. And I don't know if it's still running or not. There was a site called 4chan.
Oh yeah, 4chan's around.
Okay, yeah. So I guess, sort of QAnon and all that other kind of stuff, whatever, I don't know if it has any direct lineage, but it's sort of like maybe what people could, or Reddit or something, but this was a place, so people were just posting all this stuff, and they would post things, and it's done. It's like, and everyone was anonymous, so you could just say whatever you wanted, and but one thing some people posting were obsessed with was the Dark Knight film, the Batman film. Bane, the bad guy, this, looks like a oversized Mexican wrestler or something like that. And if you've seen the film, the beginning of the film starts out there on a plane, a small, prop. It's not just flying over, and they're taking Bane to prison or something like that. But actually, he's in charge, and suddenly, everyone's dead, and he's escaping, and the plane is crashing. And they just kept posting. They just got into it. And it was not long after that, apparently, that the tragic Germanwings crash, with a pilot purposefully flew, the small twin engine, whatever it was, into the mountains. And strange things seem to be surrounding that. Where the plane crashed was an area called Bane. And one of the investigators into the crash was named Bruce Wayne or something like that, or I forget exactly. But they seem to see parallels between the events of the things about the crash, events of the crash, and what they had been posting.
Yeah, all these like weird.
So, did we make that happen? So if it could happen by chance, what if we try to make something happen, right? And then they pick up on Pepe, and they like being politically incorrect. They like Trump. He's a hero because he's this vulgar. He just says what, tells it like it is, and he doesn't give a whatever, and so on and so on. So they would probably be into, what's his name, Andrew Tate today or something like that, or maybe if they had some intelligence, Jordan Peterson, not too much more. But they start making memes of Pepe, and Pepe as Trump, Pepe looking over the wall into Mexico. And then there's one, God, the names, the one who ran against them. That's my brain's,
Against Trump?
Clinton. No, that's more to do with my neurons than, or Hillary. But no, she made this famous quip about the deplorable,
right?
And so she names all these different characters that are in Trump's posse, and then so they put out one like that too, and then Trump himself starts getting into the act and getting it. And so what these Spencer and his alt-right fellows were celebrating is their role in helping Trump win by flooding the internet with these images, and it was called synchromysticism, which is a tech upgrade of just synchronicity, if you know the term from the psychologist Jung. which is basically all it is meaningful coincidence. You know, you're occupied with something, and something in the outer world is a direct, unmistakable reference to what you are talking about in such a way that you feel
You
someone
feel
knows.
powerful. You
Well,
created
but
that.
you also feel like somebody knows what I'm thinking. I mean, that sounds like madness, but it's that direct. And so if we think of the internet as a kind of exteriorized imagination, which is how I tend to think of it, we're living within the technological appropriation and colonization of interiority, you know, the inner
That is a
world.
loaded statement.
We are living in the process of the technological colonization of interiority. That this is the inner world. This is the last
Frontier.
place of their freedom. You know, the final frontier. You know, it's space, but it's inner space, and that sounds dark and ominous. But the more I think about transhumanism and all that kind of stuff, and the tech, oligarchy. Any case, so you think of the internet as an exteriorized imagination, right? So rather than something going on in here in the outer world, paralleling something on the internet in the outer world parallels, and that's magic. And my definition of magic is it's induced synchronicity. You somehow make a synchronicity happen, which they usually just happen on their own, but you somehow make one happen, or you make coincidences happen, something like that. So they're using the internet to get Trump into office. He's already primed himself and the world. I mean, one of the jokes I make is that the other thing too is there's reality TV. So there's all this simulation of reality, but then reality itself is being sucked in to the simulated world, because the most popular thing is in the last, 10 years, 20 years, is reality television. There's reality TV shows about people watching reality TV shows and things like that. And so what I used to say was like, we were putting so much of reality into the TV screen that there was no room, and something had to pop out, and Trump popped out from The Apprentice. So the reality became the simulacra, and the simulacra became reality, the magic mirror. And there's only so much room. Something has to pop out. He popped out. And I also say in the book that, both physicists and sort of new age visionaries talk about, the singularity, some sudden shift in reality where everything was, I remember ages ago when I first worked at the Bodhi Tree back in the late 80s, there was something called a harmonic convergence that was starting. And then the denouement of that was 2012, which, so we're on from that now quite a bit. The whole notion that after the singularity, everything's different, or like black holes is singularity. Everything's different. The laws of physics, everything's different. And I said, well, in the social world, Trump was the singularity. He said everything certainly was different after him. I don't know, do people talk about the Overton window anymore? I remember that was the thing, like the window of acceptability. What was acceptable, as and now apparently it's acceptable to storm the Capitol building, smash it up, beat people over the head with things, threaten people's lives, threaten the then vice president of the United States' life, and it's okay.
I just want to kind of ask you about this, because we talked about Richard Spencer's dream and this vision and using this like relationship online to help create reality that you have a lot of people that are engaged in. And it occurred to me because some of my left-leaning friends that were also following RFK, I think even as high as, I don't know if you know who Charles Eisenstein is, but he's a thought leader in certain ways. And they all also talked about dreaming him into the White House. And then I couldn't help but also think, as I was getting up preparing for this interview this morning, about Martin Luther King's dream. I mean, we had the coincidence, of course, of the inauguration being on his birthday. And, just thinking about like dreams and vision and imagination and creating things together for those of us that, of course, are not white supremacists. We think, Martin Luther King's dream was great. And there's been a lot of progress along that line, following that vision and dream into reality, right? But then you have actual RFK. It's hard to not think that there's actual proof that with RFK and Trump both in this administration, especially once you look at the puzzle pieces you lay out in Dark Star Rising, it's like, oh my God, there's really something to this. And of course, nefarious people could use this, psychic technology just as well as people who mean good.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's also, as you say, it's kind of harder to do good. I mean, okay, you can heal, if you know somebody, maybe you can try to heal them or something. I'm sure, but what do I want to say? Okay, not necessarily evil, but to have these kind of very precise, narrow, fixed goals. And it's that kind of application to something like that. Trump is never off message, right? So it's that kind of fix. So people have asked me, yeah, Gary, what does this mean? Why is the positive thinking only work for, something like this?
People.
So I say, well, I think in some ways it's sort of like you kind of need that kind of manic, determination, that kind of fixed. And most of us, we have other things in our lives, as well. There's other things. Or you love music, you like reading, and you don't necessarily want to do that all the time. But
you're not really. A lot of us are just like, world domination is my thing,
Oh yeah, so yeah. It's and if you look at some of the magicians in history, like some of the ones that I've written about, like Aleister Crowley, notorious magician in the 20th century, and he's famously on the cover of the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper and things of that sort. But he had this kind of, I want to say autistic, but I don't intend it to mean in the negative sort of way, but this kind of absolute fixation on, and some people in the magical world who are kind of in the far right political spectrum have seen relationships between Trump and Crowley in the sense that, that very similar kind of libertarian kind of sensibilities, but also this sort of, it's this kind of persistence. And both of them hold grudges. And both of them are vindictive and vengeful and all that kind of stuff. So it's a peculiar kind of personality.
I remember when Trump first took over, somebody was like, it's like, somebody was playing a video. We were all in a simulated reality and the video game player was great and world building and, democracy building. And then some of their kids just took over the controls and started,
Mm-hmm.
I just thought what an apt metaphor.
And if you remember, positive doesn't necessarily mean good.
Right.
I can do it. And whatever it is up to you.
Yeah.
Edward Coué in the 19th century, he had the kind of thought cure, every day and every way I get better and better. So that's a kind of positive, affirmation in that sense, but it's healing. But a lot of this stuff, it's goal-oriented. And the thing with chaos magic, which you mentioned, I didn't get onto, and I don't want to in any way, insult any chaos magicians out there, because I don't think Trump ever heard of it himself. But at least in the early days of his first administration, chaos was kind of a, byword to say, what was going on there. Because he did one thing, then he changed his mind, then he did something else, and he kept everybody waiting and hanging and all that kind of thing. And I mentioned earlier this stuff about glamour and him being in the, the wrestling world and the, beauty contests and the TV show and things of that sort. So the thing with chaos magic, and getting back to Pepe, is it's called chaos magic because, well, two reasons, but one is that rather than in traditional forms of magic, you have all of the different magical implements you need. You have the circle and the right name of the demon and the pentagrams and the cup and the wand and so on and so on. And you do everything to this precise kind of formula. The chaos magician, again, it's kind of a postmodern, it's DIY, almost like punk magic. And it started up in England around the same time as punk rock started up in the mid 70s. And it's like, use whatever's on hand, use whatever you got. So you suddenly pick something up and you can turn that into a magic, your imagination and your will. Because ultimately that's what it is. I mean, fundamentally, I mean, Crowley was one of the people working his way towards that. And there's other magicians after them, a fellow named Osmond Spare, who was also an artist, but then he developed some form of magic. Fundamentally, it got down to, well, you don't really need all the old gear. It finally comes down to your imagination and your will,
Right.
which is the same thing as mental science and positive thinking and so on and so on. But the chaos element is like you use whatever's around, and the whole idea was instead of achieve some kind of notion of serenity and unity, it's to go with the flow, constantly changing things. And then chaos theory was in the air at the time as well. And so, the importance of initial conditions. So if you're, the whole idea of a butterfly flapping its wings in Colorado causes a tornado wherever, somewhere else, because that did something. So if you can, the chaos magician has some sense of the flow, and this is something that Trump himself talks about. He kind of sees how things are going. I go with my instincts, man, and then bang, you do something, and it affects the situation, and it moves it towards your goal. And positive thinking and chaos magic, they're both goal oriented.
Right.
Yeah. It's something like it's a realizable wish or a possible reality. So you don't say, yes, I want to go to Mars or something, or whatever, go some strange thing. It's something that you could do. It's conceivable. You just want to do it quicker and easier, but it's goal oriented. And which is, again, that's, I mean, a lot of magic, it isn't that, the kind of, magic ages ago that I was interested in. It's more kind of a spiritual, meditative sort of thing, getting in touch with your higher self and stuff like that. This is like these guys, screw all that. We want to do stuff. We want to make, I don't like my neighbor. I want to be able to do stuff, that kind of thing. So I've never heard of this, but the way he did it, it kind of seemed like
he was natural at it.
Yeah, natural link to the positive thinking, and everything else was going around him. It seemed like, wow, what's happening now? So
as I was reading your book, I was recalling some synchronicities in my life and times when am I precogniting this, or am I making that happen? I have a practice before I open a business. I write down a scene that I want to happen in that business so I can think about the feeling I want to create in that place. And I have been in those moments where I'm like, oh my God, what I wrote down just happened in front of me, And so it's made me uneasy. And in terms of like, am I accidentally doing something, or should I be doing more of this intentionally, but with the aim of good? Or, like, what do we do with this information if it rings true for us? Like, is there some way to dispel? Because a lot of this is casting spells, right? So what is the way to dispel what is happening? And you mentioned, like, in the first thing, you thought that the witches were casting spells to bind Trump, and that's maybe one of the reasons why he lost. So can we talk about, like, what do we do?
So there's a fellow named Michael Hughes who did a book, Magic for the Resistance, like in Trump's first, term. And yeah, they did these witches in these monthly binding spells. They weren't trying to hurt Trump, but they were trying to trip him up, as it were, prevent what he wanted to happen from happening. But then across the other side of the planet, you have the witches for Putin, who are casting spells against all of his enemies and, cursing them with death and all this kind of stuff. So, I don't know. I mean, what can you say? What can you do? I mean, I would say, try to stay as awake and alert as possible, and make sure what's happening up here is yours.
Right.
I was tapping my forehead when I said that, but I mean, especially now, I mean, as I said, it's like, and you said as well, there's so much information coming from so many different sources, and we become so used to, paying attention to it. Probably a good thing would be just get away from all that. But then you think, well, I don't know what's happening, and then am I, trying to escape from, I know it's difficult times. It's difficult times. I think that's the first thing, you have to recognize that's how it is. And maybe it is the beginning of a new world order. I don't know. I mean, that's, I'm living here in England. Musk is trying to destabilize the Labour government here. They're no great shakes anyway, so nobody really likes them. But he would like sort of MAGA light or the Brit MAGA, which is Reform UK, which is a far right new government party led by a guy named Nigel Farage, who was invited to the party. Again, this was something that I mentioned the alt-right, and another one of their intellectual heroes was a German historian, kind of a philosopher of history, a fellow named Oswald Spengler. And he wrote a book, came out just after World War I, called The Decline of the West. And his whole idea, and he has what you would call an organic kind of view of history. So rather there being one history that started, whenever you want to say it began, back whenever where with the Egyptians, and it's, a straight line, continuous line carrying on up to us. He said, no, the civilizations are organic forms, and they're born, they grow, they mature, they decay, they die, and then a new civilization comes up and all that kind of thing. So this was one of the things that the alt-right people were saying. It's like, well, it's the end of the West now, going down, and they were in favor of Putin. And Spengler talks about the coming age of the Caesars, the new Caesars, that it was going to be a hard Roman kind of age, and sort of humanism was on its way out and all this kind of thing. And so it's like, they say, well, here, doesn't that seem to be what's happening, But there's another historian that I tend to look to. I mean, I tend to read People Know What He's Anyway. These guys are old and dead a long time ago. There's a fellow named Arnold Toynbee, who's a British historian. He wrote a huge multi-volume work called Just a Study of History. But he had a similar kind of, what we might call a cyclical view of history, but it wasn't organic. It was based on what he called challenge and response. But his theory is very simple. He says the civilization reaches what he called its time of troubles. And during that time, it's faced with the challenge. And if the challenge is too great, the civilization can't meet it and is smashed. And it happens very quickly. So the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution or something like that. Well, that's more societyless than civilization. But if the challenge is not great enough, it overcomes it too easily, and it slides into a slow moral decline of complacency and all that. But if the challenge is just right, and this is why I call it the Goldilocks theory of history. If the challenge is just right, then the civilization can muster sufficient energy, to and creative force to meet it, and also to carry on through and to, develop. So I would tend to think that that's where we are now, something along those lines. So it's not any nicer, but it's less. There's less sense of futility. If it's just an organic kind of thing, there's nothing you can do. I'm just caught. We're just individuals caught in the grip of history. It's like, well, I said people make history. It's not, history doesn't make people. People make history. Not only good people, but it's people who make it. I'm not politically minded myself. I just kind of fell into writing about this, and I wound up writing a history of Russia after writing Dark Star Rising, because I had a lot of material about Russia that I didn't use in that book. Then I just wound up researching. I just became fascinated with Russia itself, because most people in the West don't really know much about Russian history. I mean, I knew stuff about the Bolshevik Revolution or probably the terrible things like that, but not the whole thing. And that led me to understanding what Putin was doing in Ukraine. That's where Russia started. Russia as an entity started in this ancient period known as Kievan Rus, which is the equivalent of sort of the Arthurian age for the English. And it was this in Kiev down there. And this was when Vladimir I was a Slav. And the Slavs were the Vikings came on raiding parties down into Russia through the river system. And then they wound up staying there and, marrying into the locals. And so the Viking sort of blood got, just, spread out. And so that's the Slavs, that's the Russians. And he converted to Greek Orthodox Christianity. So he went from pagan to Greek Orthodox. And this was at 891 or something like that AD. And that's when they became the Russian Orthodox Church. And then they just accepted Greek Orthodox Christianity, just lock, stock, and barrel. There was no kind of, debate about anything like that. They just accepted it. And that's what Putin now, that's why one thing he wants Ukraine back, also because it was part of the Soviet Union. So he wants to bring back the near abroad. So it's all the now independent nations that used to be part of the Soviet Union. He wants to regain all that. But also, that's why Putin is selling Russia as Holy Russia, going back to this characterization to the 19th century, when it defeated Napoleon with a little help from the Russian winter. But it was Alexander the First, and it was the Holy Russian Empire and all that. The West doesn't understand anything like that. I mean, they don't really understand how endemic to kind of the Russian psyche this religious aspect is, and it's a mystical aspect as well. And they're much more, I mean, all the kind of stuff that seems weird now. So, I mean, you and I are probably aware of it already, but for mainstream world now seems like this is the weird kind of world we're in now with Trump. That's been going on in Russia forever. They've had the strangest kinds of things. They have a whole different science. It was very, very weird. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's like a very, very strange alternative kind of world. Right. Much more far out than, the West kind of scientific, view, what sort of things. Now we're like different things that don't necessarily go together or finding themselves next to each other. So far right politics and far out thinking kind of blend up there because the left is too straight and, humanistic and materialistic and scientific and all that. And rightly so. Those are necessary values and all that, but it can't appeal to this other kind of, I would say that's the mystical kind of religious side to Trump, as dubious as it is. He does give people a sense of meaning, that they're belonging to something larger than themselves.
Yeah, like any cult leader.
There's another thing I make in Dark Star Rising. You there's a gradient from the magician to the guru to the demagogue. Magician casts a spell over one person. The guru does over a smaller group or larger group, whatever. And the demagogue does over the whole people. So it's the same sort of thing. Yeah. And people under the spell of any of those find themselves able to do things that they would not normally do.
Right.
Like storm the Capitol. Or, they are relieved from their everyday limitation. And it feels good. That's why people love going to football games.
Yeah,
it feels incredibly good to do that, and we have a natural appetite for that, and that's part of our larger selves. But that can be triggered or informed by or made to happen by not necessarily what we would think salubrious kinds of things.
One of the things, especially towards the end of the book, that you talk about, and I was like, oh, because you see all of these political hypocrisies going on. It's like TikTok, for example. He's the one who started the ban, and now he's like, oh, I saved you guys, and so there's this kind of like story switching that's going on, and this hypocrisy that's going on, like on a constant thing. But their value system is not about being a hypocrite or not. It's about, like you said, going with the flow and playing the side of the coin that works. And so the value system is who's playing the game. Am I saying it right?
I just think with Trump, the whole idea of telling the truth just doesn't matter. It's like this is something. I mean, I forget the fellow's name, but he's an academic. I'm sorry, I don't have the book in front of me, but he wrote a whole thesis about bullshitting. And the difference, like Trump isn't a liar. Trump is a bullshitter. He knows what he's saying isn't true, but he doesn't care. It's the effect. A liar is concerned whether you do find out the truth or not. It's upsetting and it's just disorienting if you start thinking about things like, oh, well, he said that, and then he did that, and then he said that. And likewise on the other side, too, someone who's dyed-in-the-wool, far left, if you start questioning those, dogmas and all that as well. So what do you call the people in the middle? It's right. I'm not far right or far left. I'm left out. I'm not far right, but I'm not. I don't belong to any of these groups. From some standard, yes, you're a white male of a certain age, blah blah blah. You're a boomer, and that's who you are. And from that bio, I can tell exactly. I mean, that's I think that's one of the dangerous things that's happened in our time, and I don't know who's responsible for it, but from people being identified by groups, the groups you belong to.
What you see is the far left using the same taxes as the far right to shame and catalog and use all the different tools like that. If there's one thing that I tell people is like, stop being surprised, because you being surprised by what's going on is when you're just sitting there like confused, like, but, and then arguing with yourself over and over, expect it to be a lie, expect it to be, and so that you can focus on the positive thing that you can influence in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. Having watched things and posted some stuff, recently, I'm saying, okay, that's it. I'm not going to, there's nothing more to say. I mean, people, you can keep it up. For myself, I just feel like, well, I have to do other things. You said, oh, what should you do? It comes from the Swedish scientist, but also religious visionary Emanuel Swedenborg. He said, do the good that you know. So don't go around wondering what is good, asking metaphysical questions and what should I do? It could be sweeping your floor, taking out the trash, whatever, donating food to the local, food bank, whatever it might be. Do some good that you know. It might not address the larger issues. All acts of goodness are not necessarily, highly publicized and known. At this point, I don't know. I mean, it's 4 years. Let's see. I mean, he works fast.
Well, it's gonna be a wild ride. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Front Porch Radio. I'm Julie Weiler. My guest today is Gary Lachman. He wrote the book we're mostly discussing is Dark Star Rising: Magic and Power in the Age of Trump. He's written so many other books, but I can say that reading this book has helped me get out of that. Well, what's going on? I'm not so flummoxed by what's going on. You go into so much more in this book that is just so fascinating. I recommend that people grab it if you're in America. Bookshop.org is a great alternative to Amazon because a lot of the proceeds go to independent bookstores. And I guess we can leave on your next book that's coming out. Tell us a little bit about that, because you have lived a fascinating life.
Yeah, well, it's coming out later this year, in November, but it's a memoir. And it's about how I went from playing in music to doing what I do now.
He's a rock and roll star.
I played in some. I wouldn't say it was a star. That's actually how I started the book, but it was more of a satellite. I played in Blondie, and then I had my own band for a while. And then I also played with Iggy Pop. But this was back in the hoary days of the 70s and 80s. And no, people do ask me, how'd you wind up doing what you're doing? And I found myself without pending work, January 2023. And so I just started doodling around, with that idea. And I wound up, spending that whole year. I finished it in January 2024, writing this memoir. It's basically the influences on me. Going back to my childhood, comic books. There's a lot about comic books in it, and things like I was very much into strange, weird fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft, American horror fiction writer, and things like that. And then my teenage years, and fantasies about being a poet and things like that, and then winding up playing in Blondie in New York in 1975 when I was 19. But then subsequently, after years in music, I spent about a good 10 years wanting to write, but not being able to, or not writing anything that was any good or anyone would look at. And it took me quite some time. So there's, I name dropped quite a few people along the way, and my interest in magic for a time. I was involved with sort of Crowleyan magic in the late 70s in California. And then I was also involved in the Gurdjieff work. It's known as the Fourth Way. Gurdjieff and Uspensky. Well, Uspensky was a Russian writer and philosopher, and Gurdjieff was an Armenian Greek. And in the early 20th century, they developed this system, sort of esoteric psychology, and they brought it to the West in the 1920s. And it's influenced quite a few people, and it still goes on today. It's a very serious pursuit of waking up, of overcoming our mechanicalness. And something along those lines, although I'm no longer involved with that per se, although I've written books about people involved in it.
Where do you land today in your personal beliefs about magic and the occult?
Well, I mean, the one person who's influenced me the most is a British writer named Colin Wilson, who died in 2013. But he's best known for his first book, came out in 1956. He was 24. It's called The Outsider. And it was a study of kind of the mental strain and stresses on creative individuals in the modern world in search of some kind of more intense sense of meaning and purpose that the secular world, let's say, could provide. And he also wrote a book just called The Occult that came out in the early 70s. And I read that when I was living with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein, the singer, and the guitarist in Blondie, in this dilapidated loft space on the Bowery in New York. And if you're in New York now, you go to the Bowery, it's nothing like what it used to be. I mean, it's all incredibly overpriced,
Gentrified.
clothes shops and all that kind of stuff. But when we lived there, it was, a real Skid Row and all of that. But I had no interest in the occult before. I liked weird fiction or old horror films, the old Universal Frankenstein and Wolfman films and that kind of thing. But I just came across this book, and it was so it was compulsively readable, as book reviewers like to say. It was gripping, and I didn't know he had a whole history of writing about existentialism and stuff like that. So I actually read The Occult first, and I read The Outsider later. But he just talked about people like Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner and Crowley and Golden Dawn and a variety of other, magic through the centuries, going back to ancient shamans and stuff like that. And I was completely gripped by it. So I subsequently just read everything else that he wrote, and I went on a pilgrimage in 1983, part of a journey through Europe, a friend of mine, and then I went off on my own. I went down to visit Wilson, where he lived in a tiny little place in Cornwall, which is the far west of England. And I made a pilgrimage down there and met him, and then carried on. We carried on a friendship for 30 years after that. And I wound up writing a book about him. So his fundamental idea, if I maybe close with this, is that we have what he calls a paradoxical relationship to freedom. When it's threatened, we know exactly what it is, and we will fight tooth and nail to keep it and defend it, and do everything we can. Or at any value, whatever the highest value. But this freedom is generally comes to be, the one that encompasses all the other values in some way. Strangely enough, against our best wishes, when we secure the freedom, we very quickly start to take it for granted. And it becomes a burden. We don't know what to do with it. We want to kill time. What are we going to do? And it's going to do that. So Wilson discovered that a crisis or an inconvenience can have the effect of reminding us of our freedom. And this is why some of these outsider figures went to these great lengths to kind of overcome this sense of taking it for granted, what Wilson calls the indifference threshold. We fall back behind the indifference threshold, and we're indifferent to things, and suddenly it's threatened, and it's like, or on a smaller example, think of a book, right, that's been on your shelf for a long time, and somebody borrows it, and it's away for a while, and they bring it back, and you look at it, and it's like, oh, wow, suddenly it's very interesting again. Well, the book hasn't changed. You had taken it for granted. This is something, in a way that has to happen, because if we didn't have that happening, we'd be overwhelmed with too much significance from things. This is what happens when you take a psychedelic. This inner inhibition that Wilson calls it a tax on consciousness, this inner inhibition that cuts out the significance of things so that we can just, maneuver through them without getting caught up with them. That's suddenly gone. And suddenly everything is radiating this interestingness or meaning or something like that. Even a glass of wine. That's why poetry and wine are associated. Wine is poetry in a bottle. Suddenly you have that glass of wine and the sunshine coming through the dusty window is beautiful. And before you were like, oh, damn, I got to go clean that pretty window. Oh. So it's like you're this what he calls the robot, this all-purpose kind of evolutionary adaptation that helps us deal with things. We're usually involved in that's the mechanical side of us. We're usually in that. And we don't, again, we don't know that we're in that. We take for granted being in that state as being normal. And some strange things happen, or what the psychologist Abraham Maslow called the peak experience. Suddenly something that you took absolutely for granted strikes you as totally new and fresh and strange. And then you realize everything, that's what reality is really like. And so for a brief moment, you're outside of the robot, you push past the indifference threshold, and you suddenly see. But imperceptibly you move back. And I can't go into any more detail, but that Wilson developed a kind of psychological approach to understanding that and how to deal with it, how to live less robotically. And that's why my book about him is called Beyond the Robot.
Well, that seems very on theme with the point of what is occurring right
Absolutely.
now, with freedom certainly being the question. Thank you so much for calling in from London. I think you're my first international radio guest, so I appreciate it.
Well, let's keep up good relations.
Absolutely.
This the special relationship, let's keep up.
Thank you so much for coming. And for those of you who are listening, keep listening to WPRK 91.5 FM. You can find this podcasted on, if you go to Substack and search for Front Porch Radio, you'll find us there. Thank you again.
Pleasure. Thank you.